Hello everyone. Is it possible that China and Japan will forget about Second World War and will restore their relationship and will make it like normal relationship between these two ancient civilizations? My name is Yuval Bloomberg and I'm going to share with you my opinion about this. So I think the problem starts with the question. The question starts with the Second World War, but in order to understand the relationships between Japan and China, you cannot look only on the Second World War. You must go back 2000 years ago when the relationship started. In the 2nd century, it was the first time that Chinese travelers reported about tribes in Japan, and this actually was the first historic documenting of any event in Japan. According to Japan traditional history, the Japan nation was born 660 years BC, but no historical documentation for this. Along all the relationships, it was that Japan learned a lot from China. It was first the writing system, Buddhism, Confucianism, everything you look, even architecture, a lot of things. It was all along the history that Japan learned a lot from China. It was not consistent, like every year, every 100 years, Japan is learning something from China. It was not like this. Actually, it was like based on parallel to flowering periods of China, that a lot of influence from China came to arrive to Japan. The influence of China on Japan was not consistent, but it was definitely always in one direction. China is influencing Japan. Japan recognized China's superiority on Japan almost from its first day. This is how it was built. China actually is much more ancient than Japan. China, when Chinese travelers visited in China and reported the tribes that fighting between them, China already was hundreds of years after the first unification by Qing Emperor in China, 221 years before BC. So it was always this kind of relationships that China look on Japan like it's like, I would say maybe little sister, like little country. Like China looked like this on many other countries. China called itself and still calling itself in Chinese Zhongguo, which means the central country that standing in the middle of Earth, and everyone else is around this main country. This was the way that China see the universe around it. It lasts like this for many centuries, but not forever. China deterioration started in the 19th century. In the 19th century, with the Opium Wars against Britain, and the deterioration of Qing dynasty, which was the last dynasty in China. Then the deterioration started, and it was quick, fast, relatively. And Japan that was there and saw what went over China, Japan didn't want to go through the same process. Japan didn't want to go through this, and it was on the road to go there. Japan was opened by force by the Americans first, in the middle of the 19th century, and since then Japan chose different path to go through. It was the restoration of Meiji that symbolized the new way Japan chose, and Japan in something like one generation became strong like the Western superpowers of those days. Part of Japan's new way was to get distance from China, to keep distance from Asia. They saw Asia as inferior to the Western countries. They wanted to imitate England, France, Germany, Russia. This is what they wanted to become like this. They wanted to become imperialist country like the other imperialist countries of the West. And who they can control? They can control other countries with bigger land and with a lot of resources that can help Japan develop itself. This is how it was for Japan. And Japan initiated the first war in Korea. It was a shock for the world to see the results of this war. China lost this war against Japan. and this was the first war, and it just encouraged Japan to become even more aggressive towards China. And again, dozens of years later, the Japanese initiated another war for Manchuria. It was 1931 when the Japanese started to invade into Manchuria, looking for more resources and more land for them to develop. In 1937, Japan invaded to China, and the Second World War, which started everywhere in Europe in 1939, for China actually it started in 1931. In 1937 it took another step, and 1939 it was just already in. Nanjing massacre, which was one of the most horrific events of the Second World War, which was already full with this kind of events, it was not the only event. It was the climax. It was the top. It was just the record of dozens of years that Japan was fighting against China, was intimidating them, was trying to bite pieces of China. And I think that this was maybe the most difficult part for a Chinese, was to get this kind of humiliation from this tiny country that was almost 2,000 years inferior to them, coming to learn from them and coming to get the good stuff of China, the Buddhism, Confucianism, architecture, method of governments, a lot of things Japan took from China. And then in the end of 19th century and 20th century, Japan turned over on China and started to humiliate China. I think China could not take this. China could not take this, and I think this is one of the most difficult parts for Chinese to accept. And on top of this, Japanese never took responsibility for Nanjing massacre. Never. They never recognized this. They never took responsibility, and they never said, we're responsible and we are going to pay compensation to the families. It didn't happen. So in this case, it's just like one more event. It's just one more thing in this whole relationships between China and Japan that is unbearable for China. And in order to rehabilitate the relationship, it's not only about taking responsibility for Nanjing massacre. It's much more than this. It's actually changing the way the relationship is being managed today. China is claiming its place as the biggest superpower or the second superpower, and as China sees it, Japan is not standing in the same place as China. Japan is a much smaller country, and China is Zhonghua, central country. So Japan must recognize its place in comparison with China and behave accordingly. This is, according to my mind and according to my understanding, this is a key for rehabilitation of the relationships between China and Japan. This is really a short summary of what I think about these relationships and the future of these relationships. If you enjoy, give me a like, please click the bell in order to get more content like this. Thank you very much.